rahmatullah. Inshallah, we're going to get started now. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف الخلق وسيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم أخرجنا من ظلمات الوهم إلى نور الفهم وأكرمنا بمعرفة العلم وزين أخلاقنا بالحلم يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم ارزقنا حبك وحب نبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم واجعل محبتك ومحبة نبيك محبة تنجينا بها يوم الدين. اللهم وفقنا لاتباع سنته واقتفاء أثره. اللهم احشرنا في زمرته وتحت لوائه. اللهم اجعلنا من أنصاره وأحبابه. اللهم اجعلنا من أنصاره وأحبابه يا رب العالمين. اللهم أصلح حال أمة حبيبك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم فك الكرب عن أمة حبيبك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم في كل مكان. اللهم انصر عبادك المستضعفين في غزة وفلسطين، انصرهم نصرا عزيزا مؤزرا. اللهم انصر إخواننا المستضعفين في لبنان وفي العراق وفي اليمن وفي بورما وفي سائر بلاد المسلمين. أنت أعلم بهم منا، كلهم ناصرا ومعينا ومؤيدا وظهيرا. اللهم اختم لنا بخير أجمعين والحقنا بالصالحين واجعلنا من ورثة جناتك جنات النعيم يا أرحم الراحمين. آمين آمين وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. أما بعد, we have a special subject for today, and that subject is the vulnerables, الضعفاء. The name of the section is باب فضل ضعفة المسلمين والفقراء والخاملين. That's the name in Arabic. In English, it is on the virtue of Muslims who are weak or poor. And when we go over this subject, there's a lot to mention about the subject of ajz, disability, inability, and how it's defined in the Islamic paradigm. And we're going to discuss all of this and more as we go over the contents of the section between the verses and the hadith that Imam Nawawi shares with us. But just to preface it, in our deen, we learned that the subject of ajz is referred to as a state of mind. Ajz, disability, is not reduced to a person's actual physical appearance or one's cognitive abilities or anything of that sort. No, it's not that. It's a state of mind. What does that mean? There's a dua that we learn from the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ that says, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-ajzi wal-kasal wal-jubni wal-bukhl. And there's different variations of the rest of the hadith. وَأَعُوذُ بِكَ مِنْ غَلَبَةِ الدَّيْنِ وَقَهْرِ الرِّجَالِ as one variation. Another variation says, وَالْهَرَمِ وَالْقَسْوَةِ وَالْغَفْلَةِ وَالْعَيْلَةِ وَالذِّلَّةِ وَالْمَسْكَنَةِ. There's different variations of this dua. The summary of it is all things relating to attitude and mindset. Prophet ﷺ says, "O Allah, I seek refuge in you from cowardice and stinginess. And I seek refuge in you from grief and concern, ham and hazan. And then I seek refuge in you from being overwhelmed by debt and subjugated by people." In the rest of this, the Prophet ﷺ is telling us, in the rest of this dua, and the other variation says, "And I seek refuge in you from having qaswa, being rigid, or ghafla, heedless, or ayla." What does that mean? Dependence. Or dhilla. What does that mean? Degradation, humiliation. And maskana, being weak. It's a mindset, and that's what the Prophet ﷺ is teaching us to seek refuge in Allah from. This is from Adhkar al-Sabah wal-Masa. We should say this every single morning and every single night. "O Allah, I seek refuge in you from the attitudes that will make me weaken and wane." Whether it's due to money, due to laziness, or it's due to grief and concerns. Because all of these can have a very paralyzing effect. You know, when we think of disability, you might find with this understanding someone who is very capable physically, who's utterly disabled. And you might find someone who is, quote unquote, disabled or handicapped, but utterly able. So ajz is a mindset. Ajz or inability, it's a mindset and an attitude towards things. And we see this in real life, that sometimes some people have certain disadvantages by khilqah and creation, but those disadvantages don't end up holding them back. Yeah, some people have every reason to excel, but they don't. It's a mindset. Some people have every reason to be ahead in life. Everything afforded to them, everything easy at their fingertips, but they're paralyzed. They're paralyzed because of their attitude and their mindset, not because of anything else. So this is a very important, and you know, we see this in the example of the companions that did have certain limitations, physically or mentally. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to give those examples of the companions. But Islam never teaches us to allow limitations to actually bar us from doing great things. A perfect example of this is a companion by the name of Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Maktoum. You guys are aware of him, right? Yeah, everyone know Abdullah ibn Maktoum? Who doesn't know Abdullah ibn Maktoum? Raise your hand. A few of you don't know him? All right, the ones that do know him, what's special about Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Maktoum that you need to know? What's special about him? Surah Abasa. He's the one in the story of the frowning, when the Prophet ﷺ frowned. What else is special about Abdullah ibn Maktoum? The Prophet ﷺ used him in some of the battles as the carrier of the banner, Hamil al-Liwa. He was also left as the Amir of Medina and the leader of the Salawat when the Prophet ﷺ went out on some other battles that he didn't go out on. Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Maktoum, so many virtues and accolades that he had as a great companion of the Prophet ﷺ. Again, he was also one of the mu'adhins of the Prophet. Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Maktoum would make the adhan for which prayer? Which prayer? There's one of the prayers that we know from the Sunnah had two adhans. Which one's that? Fajr, right? Sayyidina Bilal would make adhan before Fajr time, and by the Fajr al-Kadhib, the false dawn, about 15-20 minutes before the true dawn. It would be as like an early notice. Fajr is almost in. So if you're going to fast, then make sure you get ready. If you're going to pray, make sure you wake up and get ready. So they had two adhans for Fajr. The second adhan, the actual adhan for Fajr, was made by Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Maktoum. He was someone very dear and beloved to the Prophet ﷺ. He's not the only companion, by the way, who had physical limitations. There are others. There are others, and we're going to mention them. Sometimes these limitations were due to the person's social status. And that's what you see in the very first verse that he shares with us in the section. If you want to follow along with me in the English book, it's page 481. Lesson 93, on the virtue of Muslims who are weak or poor. In the Arabic, what is it called? Babu fadli da'afat al-Muslimin wal-fuqara wal-khamilin. Right? What does that mean? So the weak Muslims, the poor Muslims, and who are al-khamilin? In our usage of Arabic today, khamil doesn't necessarily have a good reference. It refers to someone who's lazy, but that's not what it means in Fusha. Khamilin refers to people who are obscure, the nobodies. In the eyes of people, there are nobodies in the eyes of people. Khamilin, يعني khamil al-dhikr majhul. He's a person who's unknown to others. He's not a person in the limelight. He's not famous. He doesn't have power. He doesn't have money. People don't look towards him for answers or solutions. A nobody. The virtue of some of these companions who were nobodies in the eyes of people, but they were so great in the eyes of Allah. The very first verse he shares with us. قال الله تعالى واصبر نفسك مع الذين يدعون ربهم بالغداة والعشي يريدون وجهه ولا تعد عيناك عنهم. The Prophet ﷺ was commanded in this verse, be patient along with those who call upon Allah Azza wa Jal in the early part of the day and the later part of the day, al-ghadati wal-ashi, seeking His pleasure, and do not look towards any others. What's the story behind this verse? This verse and another verse in the Quran, they have close causes of revelation. The other verse is وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُم بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ. Allah Azza wa Jalla says, and do not turn away those who call upon Allah Azza wa Jalla in the early part of the day and the later part of the day. Right? تريد زينة الحياة الدنيا ولا تعد عيناك عنهم تريد زينة الحياة الدنيا ولا تطع من أغفلنا قلبه عن ذكرنا واتبع هواه وكان أمره فرطا. Allah tells the Prophet ﷺ, it's not about following the nobles. It's not about looking to those with power and position. What's the story of Abasa? It has to do with this too. The Prophet ﷺ was doing something very virtuous. He was giving da'wah. He was not just sitting in a gathering. He was giving da'wah. He was calling people to Allah. Who was he calling to Allah? The nobles of Quraysh. Why was it so critical that the nobles believe? Because in a tribal society, if the nobles believed, then their followers would also believe. So there was a critical interest in the nobles becoming Muslim. But Allah Azza wa Jal did not want the Prophet ﷺ to chase after those individuals. And in fact, He said in the greater spectrum of affairs, the likes of Abdullah ibn Maktum would be far better for the da'wah than these individuals who had power and position. So that's why the Prophet ﷺ was told those words in the Surah Abasa. And why did he frown? Why did the Prophet ﷺ frown? As he was giving da'wah, Abdullah ibn Maktum interjected. Because he came to ask the Prophet ﷺ something. He couldn't see what was happening, right? And that's why he didn't realize how critical what the Prophet ﷺ was doing. Was this a sin the Prophet ﷺ committed? No, it was not a sin. The Quran refers to him as the blind man, and جَاءَهُ الْأَعْمَى. Is this to put him down? No, of course not. No, of course not. But Allah Azza wa Jal was giving the Prophet a udhr and Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Maktum a udhr. He was giving both of them an excuse. How's that? Can al-A'ma see the Prophet ﷺ frowning? Can he see him frowning? No, he can't see him frowning. So he would not be injured by this minimum reaction from the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ did not injure Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Maktum by frowning. He couldn't see him. And on the other side, the reason why he cut the Prophet ﷺ off as he was in the middle of da'wah is because he couldn't see what was happening. So that's why he's being described here as al-A'ma. Right? So, going back to the verse that Imam Nawawi shares with us in the beginning of this section, the hadiths tell us that this is concerning the following. كُنَّا مَعَ النَّبِيِّ صلى الله عليه وسلم ستة نفر فقال المشركون للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اطرد هؤلاء لا يجترئون علينا وكنت أنا وابن مسعود ورجل من هذيل وبلال ورجلان لست أسميهما. So this is reported by Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. So these individuals, second-class citizens, some of them were formerly slaves, and others were second class because they were not from the people of Mecca. They were Arabs from other locations. And of course, it's a caste system. It's a tabaqiyya, right? First class citizen, second class citizen. We're the nobles. What did they say? If you want to talk to us, O Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, let these 6 individuals go. We would not have them dare think that we're on equal footing. لا يجترئون علينا. And this is one of the biggest obstacles for the kuffar of Quraysh in believing, is that the Prophet ﷺ came with a message that would make master and slave next to each other. How are they going to accept this? Right? So then Allah Azza wa Jal revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ. That's the other verse that's similar to this. And concerning the verse that we just read, which is in chapter 18, verse 28, it's also a similar scenario where Uyayna ibn Hisn al-Fazari came to the Prophet ﷺ, and there was one of these lower class citizens sitting with him. So then he said, I want a few words with you, but let this man leave. He's a low person compared to me. So this is why Allah Azza wa Jal revealed to the Prophet ﷺ this. Look, Islam revolutionized this idea in a very tribal society. Where does victory come from, right? Many people, especially if you have a capitalist mindset, like in tribal society, it was all about power and position, right? Even when it came to inheritance, you know who would inherit during those days? The one who was able to go out for jihad. Children, women, no, they would not inherit. Because what? They're burdens on their people. They're burdens on their people. They can't fend for themselves. So they were treated as property in those days. But Islam revolutionized this idea. Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا تُنصَرُونَ وَتُرْزَقُونَ بِضُعَفَائِكُمْ. Your victory and your provisions come from the vulnerables. Right? There was this one companion who had a brother. This brother, for whatever reason, wasn't able to work and earn. But he was very dedicated to learning everything from the Prophet ﷺ. So this brother who was wealthy, who would spend on his brother, he came to complain about the Prophet ﷺ, that his brother is a big burden on him and he has to carry all this weight by himself. So the Prophet ﷺ turned to him and he said, لَعَلَّكَ تُرْزَقُ بِهِ. How do you know? Maybe the reason why you're making money is because of this brother of yours that you've had to shoulder the responsibility for. You never know, right? لَعَلَّكَ تُرْزَقُ بِهِ. Sometimes Allah Azza wa Jal gives people those types of burdens, and He ends up giving them so much khair and barakah in their lives because of that. And it's not really a burden at all. Allah Azza wa Jal enables them and gives them the capacity to deal with it, right? And this is a very deep understanding in our Islamic tradition, right? There's no goodness we learn in a community or a nation or an ummah that doesn't really care for the vulnerables. So the Prophet ﷺ teaches us. Again, we'll share a few more examples from the life of the Prophet ﷺ about companions who had those types of limitations. But again, we learn from history and from our ummah. If you want to see the condition of the ummah, look at how the ummah treats the elderly. If the elderly are not cared for, it's a very bad sign for an ummah. It's a very bad sign for the future generations if, when people reach a certain age, they're thrown in retirement homes. It's a sign of a decline of a nation. Or when you see that people who are sick aren't cared for, people who are disabled don't have things facilitated for them. And that's why in Islamic history, this was something that was cared for, from the very beginning. Go back to the likes of Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab and Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. There were certain things set up in the government, by the government, to actually care for this. It's very tragic sometimes when you look at some of our Muslim countries and how the vulnerables are treated over there. Ya Allah, when there's no raqaba and when there's no accountability, sometimes go see how orphans are treated in certain areas. Orphans are put to work. They're treated as slave labor. They're tortured. Sometimes you see, forget about our country, you see it over here sometimes too. How many times have scandals come out because of mommy cams? Mommy cams, babysitters, or people who are caring for the elderly, and they're caught on camera hurting and abusing children or abusing the elderly. People who can't speak out and say something to defend themselves. So many scandals like this. Why? Because if there's no taqwa in the heart, and there's no accountability set in place, then there's no stopping people from doing what they may do. So this is a critical part in our deen. Now, there is another, so we said one hadith. We want to get to the hadiths in this section. I want to share with you one more before we get into that. So as we said, the victory comes from the vulnerables. That's one hadith. The other hadith, also an authentic hadith, reported in Jami' al-Tirmidhi, it says this: كم من أشعث أغبر ذي طمرين لا يؤبه له لو أقسم على الله لأبره. How many are there among the people who are dirty and disheveled, dusty? Their clothes are dusty and disheveled. They're not really appealing in terms of their appearance. They don't have the ni'mah of dunya on them. And the clothing that they wear is clothing that isn't very honorable. And they are not given any attention. But this person is very special by Allah. لو أقسم على الله لأبره. If this person took an oath by Allah, Allah would have honored his oath. Allah answers his prayers. Now that shows us something very powerful. The people who are tested and tried and afflicted in their lives have their prayers closest to being answered. Closest to being answered. Now let's start reading some of the hadiths in this section. The first hadith that comes along in both the original and the abridgment is reported on the account of Haritha ibn Wahb radiyallahu ta'ala anhu قال, he said, سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول ألا أخبركم بأهل الجنة. He said, shall I inform you about the people of Jannah? So then the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم said, كل ضعيف متضعف لو أقسم على الله لأبره. Prophet ﷺ said, the people of Jannah are all who are weak or meek. If one of them were to take an oath by Allah, he would carry it out. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, ألا أخبركم بأهل النار. You want to know who the people of hellfire are? كل عتل جواظ مستكبر. The Prophet ﷺ said, they're every person who's coarse, domineering, and arrogant. عتل جواظ مستكبر. Someone who is غليظ جافي. Someone who is very rough in his character. Someone who's very arrogant. Someone who denies people their rights. That's the people. That describes the people of hellfire. Now what does this mean? كل ضعيف متضعف. When they comment on this hadith, of course, is it good and virtuous for the believer to be strong? Yes, that's not what we're talking about. Strong in truth. Strong in truth. That's very good. كل ضعيف متضعف. This is referring to the characteristic of tawadu'. Weak and meek is someone who is hayyan, layyan, as in some other versions of this hadith that describe the people of Jannah tell us. Right? It is referring to people who are very, very humble in their demeanor. متواضع. ضعيف الحال يستضعفه الناس ويقهرونه. The people take advantage of him. Because the believer is what? The believer is very amicable, very friendly. And sometimes because he's so friendly or she's so friendly, it's taken advantage of. Right? As we learned from the Prophet ﷺ, be the better two sons of Adam. Right? Because sometimes you seek to be the better of the two sons of Adam, you get taken advantage of. Right? It's a whole lot better than taking advantage of people. It's a whole lot better than oppressing people. Now, the Prophet ﷺ is telling us here about how tawadu' and humility leads to Jannah and how arrogance leads to hellfire. This is the essence of what this hadith is. But of course, we have great figures in our past who are strong, powerful, like Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab, but powerful in truth. Right? Now, the other things that we have in our deen, we learn that when Allah Azza wa Jal takes away something, Allah Azza wa Jal gives so much more. Now, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tests someone in their hearing, or in their eyesight, or in their speech, this is not because of any mistake of theirs, or any flaw of theirs. No, abadan. As the Quran says, the Quran refers to samam and bukum and umi in a very negative context, right? People who can't hear, people who can't speak, and people who can't see. You know how the Quran refers to this? All in a very spiritual sense. The Quran says, فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَعْمَى الْأَبْصَارِ وَلَكِنْ تَعْمَى الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ. If a person's eyes are blind, maybe his eye, the eye of his heart is very aware. The Quran says it's not the eyes that go blind, it's the hearts that are in people's chests that truly go blind. So the negative connotation in hearing or speech or eyesight is all about the spiritual use of these senses, right? That's why the physical disability of these is no. That's actually a great reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's another hadith that says, if Allah tests one of His servants by taking away his two beloved ones, there's no reward for it except Jannah. What are the two beloved ones? Eyes. The eyes are the two beloved ones. How do I know that they're the two beloved ones? I will only know when they're taken away. These eyes, they're taken for granted. People take them for granted. We take them for granted. I don't expect waking up one day not being able to see. But when someone loses eyesight, then you'll realize why they are mahbubatay. These eyes make life so easy and so much convenient for me. So that's what true blindness is. Not the blindness of the eyes, the blindness of the heart. Not the deafness of the ears, the deafness of the heart, the unwillingness to listen. As the Quran says, لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا وَلَهُمْ أَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا وَلَهُمْ آذَانٌ لَا يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا. Right? The Quran says they have hearts that they don't reflect with. They have eyes they don't see with. They have ears they don't hear with. What's the point of having eyes if I'm not going to use them to discover truth? What's the point of having ears if I'm not going to use them to discover truth? Right? Who's the one who's truly incapable and disabled? You know who that one is? The one who's a slave of a worldly thing. Right? The Prophet ﷺ says, تعيس عبد الدينار والدرهم. تعيس عبد الدينار والدرهم. He is truly a loser, the one who's the slave of the dollar. That's true servitude, true subjugation, not anything else. Allah Azza wa Jal has honored and dignified the human beings. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. And human beings indignify themselves when they cut themselves off from Allah Azza wa Jal. That's why there's beautiful examples. Besides Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Maktoum, another example that we can give from the seerah is Sayyidina Amr ibn al-Jamuh. The Prophet ﷺ asked the tribe of Sayyidina Amr ibn al-Jamuh, their name was Banu Salama. So he said, Man sayyidukum? Who is your leader? Who's your chief? Right? So they responded to him, Al-Jadd ibn Qais, ala annana nubakhilu. Our chief his name is Al-Jadd ibn Qais. But we know that he's very miserly and stingy. So then the Prophet ﷺ said, وَأَيُّ دَاءٍ أَدْوَى مِنَ الْبُخْلِ. And what greater disease is there than being miserly? So then the Prophet ﷺ said to them, بَلْ سَيِّدُكُمْ عَمْرُ ibn al-Jamuh. Who's Amr ibn al-Jamuh? Sayyidina Amr ibn al-Jamuh is someone who was physically disabled. He had a limp, he had araj. And he wanted to go out with the Prophet ﷺ in jihad, in one of the battles, in the Battle of Uhud. And his children got in the way. He said, how are you going to go out? You going to go out to jihad? You can't. You're physically disabled. You're excused. Why are you doing this? So then he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, Ya Rasulullah, inna baniya yuriduna أن يحبسوني عن الخروج معك إلى الجهاد ووالله إني لأرجو أن أخطر بعرجتي هذه في الجنة. I want to enter with this limp into Jannah. That was his wish. My children are trying to stop me. So the Prophet ﷺ allowed him to join, and Sayyidina Amr ibn al-Jamuh was indeed martyred. And the Prophet ﷺ said that he entered Jannah and he no longer has his limp. He no longer has the limp in Jannah. That's gone. Right? So it's like these examples who remind us, again, who's the one who's capable and who's the one who's incapable. And like when we see the examples in reality from what's happening in Gaza, it just reminds us of this so much more. And who's more disabled? Someone living a very comfortable, pampered, spoiled life that's corrupting his character and corrupting his attitude and corrupting his perspectives? Or someone who was compelled and forced to deal with such imaginable difficulties, yet he met it with a qalb of rida, contentment, utterly liberated, having full tawakkul and trust in Allah. Who is the one who is ajiz and who is the one who's qadir? Who's the one who's capable and who's the one who's incapable? The answer is very, very obvious, right? Now this next hadith is a very, very important one. This next hadith, and I hope that it's in the translation as well. It is. It is. It's on the next page, page 482. The hadith says, عن أبي سهل بن سعد الساعدي رضي الله تعالى عنه قال مر رجل على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال لرجل عنده جالس ما رأيك في هذا. So the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, a man came by the Prophet and he told the man, what do you think of this person? The Prophet ﷺ was sitting. So then the man responded, فقال رجل من أشراف الناس هذا والله حري إن خطب أن ينكح وإن شفع أن يشفع فسكت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ثم مر رجل آخر فقال له الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم ما رأيك في هذا. Right? So the first man was a very popular man, a great man, a noble man, quote unquote. Right? So they said, this is a very noble man. This is a type of person, when he comes asking for your daughter, you accept him. When he intercedes in a situation and gets involved, you listen to him. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't comment. So then he said, مَا رَأْيُكَ فِي هَذَا? What do you think of this person? So then they said, يا رسول الله هذا رجل من فقراء المسلمين هذا حري إن خطب ألا ينكح وإن شفع ألا يشفع وإن قال ألا يسمع لقوله. مسكين, غلبان. Right? They said, this is a poor man. Oh, no, who cares about him? You know, this is the type of person, when he comes asking for your daughter, you don't marry him, your daughter. And when he intercedes and gets involved in a situation, no one cares. And when he speaks, no one wants to listen. So then the Prophet ﷺ said, هَذَا خَيْرٌ مِّن مِلْءِ الْأَرْضِ مِثْلِ هَذَا. This second man that you underestimate is actually better than the first man by the weight of the world. You don't know. The scales of Allah are very different than the scales of people. And the Prophet ﷺ understood this. The Prophet ﷺ was not someone who chased after the nobles. He was not someone who chased after prestige or power or position or affluence. And that's why you find many examples. There's other examples of another man, for example, that wasn't named. He was a blind man. And this man wished for the Prophet ﷺ to visit him. And he kept on insisting for the Prophet, please come visit me. I want you to come visit me. I want my house to be blessed by you coming and praying in my home. So the Prophet ﷺ honored this blind man's request. He said, انطلقوا بنا إلى البصير الذي في بني واقف نعوده وكان رجلا أعمى. Let's go visit him. Let's go spend some time with the vulnerables. The Prophet ﷺ made this a regular sunnah of his. And he actually honored the man. He prayed in his home to give it the blessings. He prayed salah, 2 rak'ahs in his home. Now, this shows us how the Prophet ﷺ set a very just standard in the community of the Medina. You see the verse mentioned at the bottom of 482? إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. It's very beautiful when you find a community or a society actually living by this. Who are the most honorable by Allah? Not anything else, no other standard. It's not by, you being Arab or non-Arab, or this color or that color, or this language or ethnicity or that ethnicity. No, none of this. This is not what makes people better or worse. What makes people better or worse? Taqwa. It's the golden standard. It is the golden standard, right? If I actually follow this, then most of my problems will wither away. If I truly make my standard in my relationships and dealings taqwa, People of taqwa, I want them very close to me. I'm going to bring the people of taqwa into my house. I'm going to let them eat on the same dinner spread as me. I'm going to associate with them as my friends. Those are my friends. Who are my best friends? The people of taqwa. Allah, you're going to save yourself from a lot of headache and a lot of nonsense that people find themselves pulled into. Why? Because they're in gatherings and settings where there's lack of taqwa. Right? I'm going to make taqwa the standard in all of my dealings, my business dealings, my marital relations, and so on and so forth. That person is a wise person. I'm going to share with you guys a story that relates to that. I'll share with you one more. There's a companion during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, whose name was Zahir. He was a Bedouin companion, and he was physically deformed. And the Prophet ﷺ loved Sayyidina Zahir. And he would joke around with him. So one time, he came from the back, from Sayyidina Zahir, and he said, who will buy the slave? Who will buy the slave? He wasn't a slave. He said, Man yashtari al-abd? He was joking with him. Who's going to buy him? So then he said to the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, idhan wallahi tajiduni kasidan. You're not going to make any money off of me. I'm a nobody. Who's going to want to buy me? Right? If I was a slave and you were to sell me, you're not going to make any money. إذن فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لكنك عند الله لست بكاسد لكنك عند الله غال. He said, you're not someone who's bankrupt by Allah. You're someone who's very valuable and precious to Allah. That's Sayyidina Zahir. Another example. From the examples of the companions who were tested in their physical abilities, right? So, if we go to the next hadith, here, the next hadith says, عن أبي سعيد الخدري رضي الله تعالى عنه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال احتجت الجنة والنار فقالت النار في الجبارون والمتكبرون وقالت الجنة في ضعفاء الناس ومساكينهم فقضى الله بينهما فقال إنك الجنة رحمتي أرحم بك من أشاء وإنك النار عذابي أعذب بك من أشاء ولكليكما علي ملؤها. This is a hadith, it's an authentic hadith in Sahih Muslim. It's on the next page in the translation. Paradise and the fire were in a dispute with each other. The fire said, I contain the tyrants and the proud. And paradise said, I contain the weak and the destitute. So Allah decided between them and He said, you, paradise, are my mercy. I show mercy through you to whomever I wish. You, fire, are my punishment. I punish by you whomever I wish. It is upon me to fill both of you. It is upon me to fill both of you. Sallallahu salama wal afiyah. May Allah Azza wa Jal protect us from that. The fire of hell. Wal iyadhu billah. Now, the next hadith is similar to one of the hadiths that we already read, so we won't really spend much time with it. The hadith says, عن أبي هريرة قال رضي الله تعالى عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم رب أشعث أغبر مدفوع بالأبواب لو أقسم على الله لأبره. لو أقسم على الله لأبره. Right? Perhaps the Prophet ﷺ says there is many a disheveled and dusty person who is driven away from the doors, but if he were to swear an oath by Allah, he would fulfill it. Now, there are other companions from among the companions who were disabled, right, and who did not have much status. But the Prophet ﷺ loved them, honored them, realized that greatness would come to the Ummah of Muhammad ﷺ through them. And he taught the companions to honor them. One of these companions, his name is Dhul Bijadain, right? Dhul Bijadain. This companion, there's not much said about him in the seerah, but we know that he is someone who, when he passed away, again, he was someone who was very, very poor, impoverished. And when he passed away, the Prophet ﷺ saw to his burial himself. He got inside the grave and he buried him with his own hands. Some of the companions did not start off poor. Like we had some examples in the example of Sayyidina Mus'ab. Sayyidina Mus'ab was from a very, very affluent family. He lived a life of mata' and ease and luxury until he became Muslim. When Sayyidina Mus'ab became Muslim, he went through all kinds of struggles and sacrifices for Islam. This person who once lived a luxurious life, when he came to die, the Prophet ﷺ and the companions, they marveled at his situation. He left this dunya with not enough clothes to even cover his body. He had one garment that when you were to lift it up to cover the face, it would show the feet. And when you were to lower it down to cover the feet, it would show the face. That's what he left his life with, right? Some of the companions, they had to make that type of sacrifice for this deen. They weren't poor, but they sacrificed so much that they left with nothing from this world. Another example of this is Sayyidina Suhaib ibn Sinan al-Rumi. Sayyidina Suhaib, when he wanted to make hijrah, the mushrikeen stood in his way. And they weren't going to allow him to leave. He said, you want to leave? You came to us a nobody, no money. And now you want to go from Mecca to Medina with all the money you made by us. We will not allow this. He said, what if I tell you where all my money is? Will you let me go? So they said, yes, give us all your money and we'll let you go. So he showed them where he hid all his money. And he came to Medina with only the clothes on his body. And when he came in, the Prophet ﷺ looked at him and he said, رَبِّحَ الْبَيْعُ أَبَا يَحْيَا رَبِّحَ الْبَيْعُ أَبَا يَحْيَا. The transaction has indeed been profitable, O Abu Yahya. Now, again, he accepted poverty because of something he believed in. He accepted poverty because it was his path to Allah's rida. Right? So that's part of what we're talking about here. The reason why the people who were du'afa and masakeen were in such a coveted state was because their trials removed the distraction of dunya from their eyes. They weren't blinded by the trivial things that can easily blind people in this world. And that's why they had such a special status by Allah Azza wa Jal. One of these companions, last story I'll share with you, one of these companions, he came to the Prophet ﷺ seeking marriage. And the Prophet ﷺ suggested a certain girl for him to get married to. And when the parents found out, the father was in a very big dilemma. What am I gonna do? Right? What am I gonna do? I don't want my daughter to get married to this disabled man who doesn't look appealing in any way. He went and talked to his wife. And she said, and why is the Prophet ﷺ suggesting him for our daughter? Why doesn't he marry him his own daughter? Right? This was the response of the mother. So then the girl heard the parents arguing, and she said to them, please, if this is the wish of the Prophet ﷺ, then let me marry him. And so the Prophet ﷺ found out that this girl turned out to be wiser than her parents, and he made a dua for her. He said, Allahumma subba alayha al-khayra sabba, wa la taj'al 'ayshaha kaddan kadda. Oh Allah, shower her life with so much goodness, and don't make her life difficult in any way. So then, as soon after they got married, this companion went out in battle, and he was martyred, and is referred to as Ghasil al-Malaika. He is washed on his his wedding night. He was martyred immediately after his wedding night when he went out with the Prophet ﷺ, and he said that the angels performed ghusl for him. And this woman, after he had passed away, the Prophet ﷺ's dua was answered for her. And she had so much wealth, prosperity, and all of the men of Medina sought to get married to this woman after she was widowed from her husband who had passed away. Because of her wisdom, and because she knew that what the Prophet ﷺ had for her was better than what dunya has for her. So subhanAllah, it's another example from among the stories of the vulnerables that's important to reflect on. There's another hadith here. It's not. It's the last hadith that's mentioned in this section, in the English. It says, عن أبي هريرة رضي الله تعالى عنه عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إنه ليأتي الرجل السمين العظيم يوم القيامة لا يزن عند الله جناح بعوضة. You will find the individual who is very massive in size on the day of judgment, so great, so big and vast that he'll not weigh the wing of a gnat. He'll be weightless on the day of judgment. That's how the hadith the Prophet ﷺ tells us, because the weight of people is in their hasanat, in their sayyi'at, and this person has none. Right? The next hadith he shares in the Arabic, it's not in the English, is when the caretaker of the masjid passed away. It's reported on the account of Sayyidina Osamah, says, sorry, not Sayyidina Osamah, on the account of Sayyidina Abu Hurairah, who says that the Prophet ﷺ saw the absence of the caretaker of the masjid, the one cleaning the masjid. And some narrations say that it was a man, some say it was a woman. So then the Prophet asked, and they told him she passed away. So then the Prophet ﷺ said, أَفَلَا كُنْتُمْ آذَنْتُمُونِ بِهَا? Why didn't you tell me that she passed away? فَكَأَنَّهُمْ صَغَّرُوا أَمْرَهَا. It's as though they didn't really see it as something significant. Who is it? It's just the caretaker of the masjid. It's not like someone special, right? It's not someone big or well-known or prominent. So then the Prophet ﷺ said, دُلُّونِي عَلَى قَبْرِهَا. The Prophet ﷺ went to her grave directly and he performed the janazah prayers and he made dua for her by her grave. And then he said the words, إِنَّ هَذِهِ الْقُبُورِ مَمْلُوءَةٌ ظُلْمَةً عَلَى أَهْلِهَا. These graves are very dark places, lonely places. وَإِنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى يُنَوِّرُهَا لَهُمْ بِصَلَاتِي عَلَيْهِمْ. And Allah gives nur to these graves by my prayers for them. Ya Allah. So this is a little bit about what this section offers in terms of giving us guidance about the attitude. And there's so much more. The next section in the original text that you could go and read on your own is Babu Mulatafat al-Yatim. What does Islam tell us in terms of honoring orphans? Like imagine, one thing that we learn in our deen is the more vulnerable the demographic, the greater sin it is to breach and violate their vulnerability. Like one of the worst things that you could possibly do is violate the rights of an orphan. That's why there's so many verses in the Quran mentioning the rights of the orphans in Surah An-Nisa. And what does the verse say? It's a very scary verse. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ أَمْوَالَ الْيَتَامَى ظُلْمًا إِنَّمَا يَأْكُلُونَ فِي بُطُونِهِمْ نَارًا وَسَيَصْلَوْنَ سَعِيرًا. Those who consume the wealth of orphans wrongfully, they're consuming in their bellies the fire of hell, and they're going to be cast into the blaze. وَسَيَصْلَوْنَ سَعِيرًا وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. So there's a lot more, and on the verse end, the greater the reward, the greater the vulnerability, the greater the reward in honoring that person. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, what? أَنَا وَكَافِلُ الْيَتِيمِ فِي الْجَنَّةِ هَكَذَا أَوْ كَهَاتَيْنِ. Right? Prophet ﷺ, he says that I and the one who cares for the orphan is like this in Jannah. And he did that this with his two fingers. He said, this is how close I and the caretaker of the orphan or the guardian of the orphan will be in Jannah. And there's so many hadiths. And may Allah Azza wa Jal make us of those who honor whom He honored. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who realize the true value in things and the true value of people. The scales of Allah are very different than the scales of people. And if I'm someone who really seeks to not be disillusioned by life, I will follow this and not looking at how things appear, but by looking beyond them to the meanings that are there. وَهَكَذَا. I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to give us acceptance and tawfiq. And before we close for today, I'll see if there's any questions. In the section, we have in the group, there's a Slido. Let's see if anyone we just have one question here that says, how do we prevent ourselves from becoming callous when people continue to take advantage of our kindness for the sake of Allah? This is an important question. This is a very good, important question. Again, how do we stop ourselves from changing when people take advantage? This is the people who change when people hurt them are changing because of emotional wounds. And emotional wounds run deeper than physical wounds. When you get a physical wound, what do? You medicate the area, you put a bandage on it, it goes away. But sometimes emotional wounds, they fester for years. And they affect the way people look at others, life, themselves. Emotional wounds are scary. You should be careful from this. How do I prevent myself from changing when people take advantage of my kindness? I need to do a lot of talking to myself. And I need to be very, very clear on my intentions and my motives. If I am doing something for a human being, then 9 times out of 10, I will feel a sense of failure. I will feel a sense of failure. Why? Because this person will either not appreciate it, or will not honor it, or will not to return it in kind, or so on and so forth. If I'm doing it for the human will fail you 9 out of 10 times. But if I am able to strategically envision it in a very different light, that when I'm transacting with people, I'm actually transacting with Allah Azza wa Jal, it makes it so much closer to being able to overcome this. Why? Because even if human being X, Y, or Z doesn't do anything for me, who's doing something for me? Who's preserving it for me? Who's taking care of me? Allah Azza wa Jal. So if this person doesn't give it to me, it's okay. I'm waiting for something far better, right? And when you start comparing what people could do for you versus what Allah could do for you, what Allah could do for you is so much better. So this is advice I give for people. Don't let yourself get into this mindset. And it's hard. It takes a lot of tarbiyah, ruhiyah. Like it takes a lot of spiritual discipline. Like, how can I continue to do something good for someone who I feel doesn't deserve it? Right? I feel like they don't deserve it. Why should I do something good for this type of person? Well, if it is for this type of person, then I can understand why you think like that. But if it is for Allah and this person is just a vehicle to that, then you know what? There's a beautiful hadith. You know what it says? Every time a believer plants a tree, anything taken from it, stolen from it, or eaten by an animal from it, all of that is a charity for him. That's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. What? People steal from the tree, it's going to be a charity for me. Yes. Why? Because their actions do not affect mine. Right? When I do something good, it's for my own goodness. But if I allow myself to get into the tit-for-tat mindset and mentality, then what? I will become lowly when people are lowly. And I will become good when people are good. And that's not the precedent that Islam wants me to set for myself. So again, how do I... Now this doesn't mean that I need to... You can't be thoughtful with things. Yeah, no, of course. If you feel like your efforts are not really getting you very far in certain interactions and dealings, if you, instead of you changing a reality feel like it's changing you for the worse, it doesn't mean you can't pivot and be thoughtful and deliberate. Well, maybe then my time is better spent, strategically in other things. That's a fine decision, but it should not come as an emotional reaction. Like, all right, so I'm used to dealing with person X, Y, or Z. I've been friends with them for a lifetime, but I don't feel like this friendship's going anywhere for me. I'm trying to get closer to Allah and I feel like these people are pulling me away from Allah. I try to do good things and they return it with the most horrible things that end up distracting me in my prayers. Right? If that's the case, then it's okay. I could make strategic decisions and limit certain interactions, but it won't come as an emotional response. It'll become as a strategic response. That's how I would answer that question. Wallahu alam. There's one other question that came when the Prophet ﷺ says a specific Sahabi is in Jannah. Does this mean that the Sahabi already is experiencing Jannah in Barzakh? Yeah, the people in the realm of the Barzakh, they experience Jannah in a certain way. But it's different than when you experience it in the Akhir. They experience it from a distance, I guess you could say. They experience it from the aura or the realities of Jannah in their graves. Like a doorway to Jannah is open for them. Right? But is it the full experience? No, the full experience is in the Akhirah, not in Barzakh. And that's why the first person to enter Jannah is who? The Prophet ﷺ. The guardian of the door of Jannah, when the Prophet ﷺ knocks on it, asks, who is it? And he says, Muhammad. And then he responds, I was commanded not to open for anyone before you. So the full experience of Jannah is in the Akhirah, but there will be an experience in Jannah in the realm of the Barzakh. Yeah. Any other questions before we close for tonight? Yes. Oh, Jazakallah khair. So the next week's chapters. MashaAllah. You want to prepare from now? All right. So next week, we'll be talking about chapters on rights of family. There's a section on Birr al-Walidain, fortifying ties of kin, and the rights of parents, the rights of siblings, and so on and so forth. So we'll talk about those hadiths, inshallah ta'ala. Okay? I'll look up the page numbers and send them to you. I think there's a few chapters on it in the book that talk about family. I think it's a whole section. جزاكم الله خير سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله عليكم السلام ورحمة الله Assalamu alaikum, Sister, what's her name again? Sister Nadia. Do we still have copies of the book downstairs? Yeah, if anyone needs a copy of the book, you could go get from the office. Jazakumullah khair.